Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Zahid. Thank you, Nuzat, and thank you, Abdullah. Fascinating start to our distant socializing session here. We've really, I know that many of us really enjoyed this session, and hopefully we'll have you on more often. For those of you that have just dialed in, you're listening to the 14th Concordia Forum Distant Socializing Under Lockdown session. We have been running these every single week during the lockdown, and now we've just begun doing them once a month. And to this particular session now, it is my great honor to introduce two very distinguished individuals who will be taking us through a wonderful conversation. We are very, very lucky to have as our chief guest for the next hour, Anneliese Dodds, who is the Shadow Chancellor and Cabinet Minister with the UK Labour Party here in Britain. And moderating session with Anneliese is going to be ITV's political reporter, and I recently learned a fellow East Londoner, Shehab. So Shehab, over to you, and welcome to you both, and I'm much looking forward to the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we get underway, just a few housekeeping rules. In case you've just logged on, everything that's taking place now is under Chatham House rules. For those of you who don't know, that means you're free to use the information you hear, but you cannot identify or source it to anyone in any way whatsoever. Just to introduce myself, I'm a political reporter for ITV News. I've been covering politics for a number of years now. So initially it was the Brexit referendum, then it was Brexit, and now we are, of course, talking about everything that's going on with coronavirus. But I'll stop talking about myself. As we've just heard, the chief guest is Anneliese Dodds. We've crossed paths already in Westminster a few times. We've done a couple of interviews together while you were serving in the Shadow Treasury team under John McDonnell. But for those of you who don't know much about Anneliese Dodds, she's now the Shadow Chancellor. So before we kick off and we start talking about the politics, can we just get a bit of an overview about you on an individual level? What were you doing before you became an MP? Give us an update and an overview of your career so far.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Shehab, and thanks to Muddassar as well for the invitation. It's so good to be here with all of you. It's really lovely. I guess I have to say I always feel very embarrassed about talking about myself. You know, this is something that doesn't come naturally to me. But I suppose I had relatively ordinary upbringing, I guess. My father was an accountant, so I was always quite interested in financial issues. But for a very, very long time, I worked as an academic. So I worked in universities, teaching particularly comparative public policy, so how public policies work in different countries. I'm still really interested in that, and you know, it'll be really fascinating to get views from all of you, of course, with your thoughts from across the pond as well as in the UK. So I did that for, goodness, about 10, 15 years. I'd always been involved in the Labour Party since I became an adult, actually, since I was 17, 18, but it was normally just on the side rather than my main activity. And then a friend asked if I would like to put myself forward for the European elections. And I, at that time, said no, because I actually was expecting a child. I thought it would be too difficult to do that at the same time. But then my partner said, well, you're always complaining when you see on the television the coverage of European news, you're always complaining about the lack of a British perspective on this. Why don't you put your money where your mouth is and try and do something about it? So I did put myself forward then. I was an MEP. I won that election for a couple of years. Particularly served on the Economic Committee within the European Parliament, and then, yes, got elected into the Westminster Parliament in 2017 and joined the Shadow Treasury team then. So the constituency that I represent, the place that I'm talking to you from now, is Oxford East. It's very much, I would say, where the population centre is in Oxford, where a lot of the industry is, possibly a slightly different image of Oxford to that which many tourists might get, because, you know, we don't have all of the kind of tourist attractions here, but we do have the places where many people live and work, and actually quite a high degree of deprivation in some of the communities in this constituency. But yeah, really, really good to be with you and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Anneliese is a rare breed in British politics, where you have someone who's actually an expert in the field that is their brief. So very often in British politics, you get someone who is leading up a department or serving as the shadow minister for that department, and they've not actually spent much time working or studying in that field. Now, you're vying to be the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, or the next Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer. What makes you so different from John McDonnell, the man who was in the job before you? We've seen a new Labour leader come in. Where do you see yourself politically?
Yeah, well, I did work closely with the previous Labour Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, as you said. I was a junior Shadow Minister in his team, and I really appreciated, the passion that he had for changing things, for making our economy fairer, for trying to deal with, in fact, many of the issues that are really facing us now, I would say, in the UK about, long-term lack of appropriate funding for our public services, the fact lots and lots of our families are really not very financially resilient at all. So he was very passionate about those kinds of causes, and obviously I supported him in that. As you said, Shehab, we have turned the corner, I guess. Now we've got a new Labour leader in place with a different approach. I would say still very much wanting to be putting forward those strong, quite transformative plans, particularly in the area of the economy. But I think clearly we've got to, as a Labour Party, be communicating much more openly and clearly with people than perhaps we did before, because we've obviously lost a number of general elections now. So we've got to learn from that and I think change our approach accordingly.
So what we're going to be talking about today, so we've done a little bit about you, so everyone has a better understanding of where you are politically and ideologically. We're going to be talking about getting back to normality after lockdown. Now, we've been, in the UK anyway, in this position since the 23rd of March, so it has been quite a while that these restrictions have been in place. Now, we're seeing Boris Johnson and the government slowly starting to ease off some of these measures, sort of in a drip feed way. So every few weeks, we're getting new freedoms back. So as it currently stands, we're still not allowed to move about freely completely, but you are able to exercise as often as you want. You're allowed to go see other people in groups of 5 or 6 if you're having a socially distanced barbecue, for example. Do you think we're easing off these lockdown measures in the right way and at the right speed? Because there are concerns at the moment that the rate of infection, that R rate, is actually a little bit higher than it needs to be right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, particularly in certain regions of the country where, worryingly, we seem to see that reproduction rate of the disease, the reinfection rate, potentially even going above 1 in the northwest of the UK. Well, I keep going. Somebody just give me a wave if I should stop at any point. So I think people are very concerned. I mean, from the Labour Party's point of view, I guess we're aware that any decision about reopening was going to be a difficult one to take. We appreciate that. But we feel like the process has been made a lot riskier because of a variety of things that have happened and not happened in the UK context. So we've had quite mixed messages really about what people are meant to do, especially if they think they have coronavirus in the UK. People should stay at home. They must stay at home if they think they have the virus, and so should all of their household. And there's been kind of a lot of discussion and argument around this recently in the UK without going into the whys and wherefores. But, there's concern that the public health messaging isn't as clear as it needs to be. But then the other big thing that hasn't really happened to the extent that it should have done in the UK is that we're really pretty far behind when it comes to so-called test, track and isolate. So, lots of other countries had those systems in quite early so they could identify where the disease was and really quickly trace all of those who'd come into contact with it. We were promised that would be in place before the unlocking, but actually just kind of over the last week, there seems to have been some evidence that there are really pretty big gaps still there. Now that needs to be fixed as a matter of urgency. So, our concern isn't to be trying to make party political points about this. It's to say to government, look, you've got to fix this. Here are ways that you can do this, and please do it as quickly as you possibly can, because otherwise, yes, we could have that rise in infection again. And, the worst thing would be if we had to go back into lockdown, full lockdown again. That would be really damaging.
I mean, what do you think is the right time frame for this? There are plenty of people across the country who are itching to go back to work. People are getting fed up of being at home. There are also concerns about the economic impacts. That's your area of expertise. We've heard from the Bank of England, who are suggesting and predicting that we could be facing one of the worst recessions, not just in our lifetime, but over the last 200-300 years or so. So at what point do you think enough is enough? We need to start easing off the lockdown measures and people need to go back to work?
Well, I don't think we should view the health imperatives as in conflict with the economic ones, because ultimately, if we do unlock without those conditions being there, you know, particularly without having the right testing, tracing, isolating machinery there, then we'd likely see another wave of lockdown again. And that would be very, very damaging, I think, because currently, you know, there are lots of people who are putting off decisions about consuming, you know, if we want to put it in those terms, you know, people who are putting off decisions about organizing a holiday or putting off decisions about buying a new car, that kind of thing. Now, if we keep having repeated lockdowns, or if we just have a general lack of confidence that people are safe if they go into different businesses, then that will lead to people changing their approach to consumption into the long term. And obviously that will have a very negative impact on demand at a time when we really need people to be thinking about getting back out into the economy again. So I don't think we should look at them in opposition. I think, to be honest, all directions are fraught with risk currently. I mean, you didn't mention it, Shehab, you mentioned many other things, but another area where there's a lot of concern, of course, is around schooling also, where we know there are risks in both directions. You know, there's risks from children going back to school, but there are also risks from children not being in school in terms of their future educational attainment. But we really think what's got to be done to deal with this is to try and get those conditions in place, particularly test, track, isolate. And that gives us the best chance, hopefully, of not having to have additional lockdowns into the future.
Again, I want to talk about more about the economic impacts of whether or not we ever go back to life as normal. So at the moment, the government suggests that social distancing means that we should stay 2 meters away from one another. That's the figure that they've put out. Now, there's been some controversy over that in Westminster in the last few days or so. MPs are debating about whether or not that 2 meters could be reduced down to 1 meter. And that's because the World Health Organization has their figure at 1 meter. So we are sort of going a bit further than they are. Now, in terms of the economy, some MPs are saying having a 1 meter distance would mean that more industries can actually go back to work, and it would be better for the economy. Where do you stand on that? Are you happy with that 2 meter, or do you think it should be revised to be in line with the World Health Organization?
Well, I think on this decision, as with all of the others around our response to this disease, we've got to have as much transparency as possible, and we need to understand why decisions are being taken by government and why they're being stuck to. I mean, there's that one around the 2 meter rule. We've also seen controversy, of course, this week around the use of quarantine for people coming into the country from other nations. And clearly the government has said that it needs to be there for everyone who comes in for 14 days. Now, what we've been saying is, well, we've got to see the data and evidence that's underlying this, because on a number of different, in a number of different policy areas, the UK is going in a different direction to many other countries. You know, whether that applies to those kind of issues about distance. I mean, interestingly, in Germany, it's 1.5 meters. So, you know, countries seem to be taking a lot of different approaches to this. But, you know, whether it's around that, whether it's around the different sectors that are opening and when they're opening, or it's around those issues concerning quarantine, I think that the public actually deserve to be able to see that data and evidence, and people will look at it carefully, and we've seen very high degrees of compliance. So I don't think, you know, maybe sometimes there's been a view that this information shouldn't be shared with the public. Actually, our approach is it should be, and that will lead to far greater compliance, and we should trust people around this.
So you mentioned the evidence and the science, and there's been a lot of debate, not just here in the UK, but over the world about the science. Here in the UK, we have a SAGE committee, so a committee of leading scientists from a number of institutions across the country who are feeding in information. And the government has repeatedly said they are being led by the science, that every decision that they take is based on the scientific evidence that is put in front of them. In the last week or so, in the last couple of weeks, we're seeing members of this SAGE committee come out, and they've been a lot more critical of the government's approach. What have you been making of what appears to be a bit of a fracturing of opinion between the politicians and the scientists?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has been very concerning. We've also seen some politicians seeming to almost kind of blame some of the scientists for particular decisions, and I don't think that's helpful. I mean, one way to prevent this is, as I just mentioned, to be open about what the evidence is, and also to be open if it points in different directions, to have that transparency in order to build trust. I think that's very, very important. But then I think also, you know, what, if I'm honest, has been frustrating in the UK context is that we have had repeated warnings, particularly around that public health communication side, about the need for us all to be reinforcing those messages. And that hasn't always happened in the UK context, as I said, particularly around the need for those who have coronavirus-like symptoms to make sure that they stay at home and people in their households stay at home. And, you know, I've raised this directly with the Chancellor, actually, because I am concerned that unless we have that clear communication, which the scientists have kept putting out, not necessarily all the politicians, then we could ultimately have that, you know, lengthened lockdown or reimposition of lockdown that, as we were just talking about, would be really damaging for our economy.
Now, I've got a few more questions for you before we go through some of the questions we've got from people who are listening and have been selected beforehand. We've got people from all over the world listening here, especially from the United States, and it would be wrong of me not to ask you about what you think about some of the things that Donald Trump has been saying and doing in the last few months or so. I'm going to keep that completely open-ended. I'm not going to give you any specific examples. I'm going to ask you upon your opinion about the leadership we've seen from the man who is, in theory, the leader of the free world.
Well, we desperately need leadership now, don't we? And we need leadership that's committed to multilateralism, that's committed to internationalism, that's committed to putting ultimately, you know, people's interests first and not ideology or personal gain or narrow political interest. And, you know, I think it's very, very hard, even for those who are supporters of Trump, to suggest that he has been doing that over recent months. You know, I've been desperately concerned by what's happened, particularly in the last few days and weeks, where we've seen, you know, a pretty horrible reaction, to be honest, to the really appalling events with the death of George Floyd. You know, I've been very concerned about them. Lots of UK politicians have been as well. And, you know, I think we have seen the kind of proliferation of some of these strong men, you know, in political circumstances in different countries, who think that they show their strength through, you know, not thinking of others, not empathizing, creating division. Well, to me, that's not leadership. Actually, that's an abdication of leadership, and we're all suffering as a result of it. So that's how I would, I guess, summarize my views around what's been happening recently.
Do you think there's been an impact on British politics and the way in which we have dealt with this pandemic because of what's been going over on the other side of the world in the United States? Do you think the two have played into each other?
I think that's a really interesting question. I suppose, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what others on this call think. There has been a bit of a tendency, I suppose, at least initially. I mean, we're seeing change now in many other contexts, but initially there was almost a kind of, amongst those some of those on the political right, by no means all, not at all everybody, but almost an attempt to downplay the significance of this outbreak, right? Okay, so we saw that initially, suggestions it was overblown, that, you know, ultimately this was something people had dealt with before, just like outbreaks of the flu, etc. And that seems to be continuing in some political contexts. I mean, obviously we're seeing that in Brazil in particular. And maybe there was initially an element of that in the UK, which paralleled some of the discussions in the US as well, and some of the suggestions about why people didn't need to worry so much about this. It feels to me like we're moving out of those woods now, not least because we can sadly see all around us the impact of that disease. And, you know, very few families don't know somebody who's been touched by it. So I suppose I hope that might lead to some questioning of those who take that very kind of gung-ho, strongman approach into the future, because clearly it's served us very, very badly during this crisis.
Yeah, so my next question was going to be, is it a coincidence that it's the United States, it's the United Kingdom who have been worse hit? Is it a coincidence that Brazil seems to be not far behind when the political leaders of those three countries, ideologically, in the last year or so, have been fairly similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be very careful here, haven't we? I'm sure that in every country, there will need to be a very thorough investigation of how we got to where we are. And that clearly applies in the UK context. You know, there were previous inquiries conducted into how well prepared we were for a pandemic. And one of them, Cygnus, occurred just a few years ago, and it said that actually the UK was very poorly prepared, and yet those lessons were not taken on board. And we need to understand why they weren't, why it's taken so long to deal with many of the issues that have affected us. You know, I think there has been an unwillingness to take responsibility for some of the problems in the UK context. I mean, for example, I've had a lot of communication with care home owners right across the country who've been saying to me they just couldn't get anybody to take responsibility for testing their patients in their care. Everyone was passing the responsibility between them, but at the top national political level, they were being told, oh, this is fine, everyone can be tested. So I think there is an issue about a lack of responsibility being taken by those in power. And that will need to be looked at very, very carefully into the future. But to be honest now, I don't want us to look backwards right now. You know, I want us to try and do everything we can to get out of this crisis now, try and fix those problems. And then, you know, we can investigate anything that went wrong, you know, once this is passed. But right now, let's try and, you know, help the vulnerable and get through this situation.
My last question to you before we start taking contributions from people who are listening. You mentioned about getting back to normal. And one of the things that Labour has been very supportive of so far is the government's furlough scheme, where they've been paying for up to 80% of people's wages for the last few months because we've been in lockdown and people haven't been able to get to work. Now, that's going to continue on until July, but after that, it's going to slowly start to be tapered. Do you think that's the right idea? I know we're back on your area of expertise. Is that the best way to get the economy back to normal?
Yeah, I mean, that furlough scheme clearly cannot continue exactly as it is forever. I mean, it wouldn't be good for those indeed who have been furloughed, who might be able to go back to work. That's why we argued very strongly for part-time working to be enabled within the system. And now finally, eventually, it is going to be put in from the beginning of July. But also, you know, it is a scheme that is ultimately a very, very expensive scheme. You know, we have to be honest about that. It's incredibly expensive to keep it going. But the answer to that, we think, is to make it more targeted, to support those people who are still effectively under lockdown, will be for a long time. So those people who, in a UK context, are described as shielding, so people who've got, you know, severe health problems that mean that they can't go into the workforce, and those people whose employment is just completely closed currently because of the public health rules. So, you know, people who work in restaurants, for example, which can't open currently. It doesn't make sense to adopt the same position for every sector in the UK, but that's what we're seeing happen now. So we said, look, let's have a targeted approach to this. Let's make sure that those sectors which will be viable eventually in the future, but which aren't now, that they have that support to keep them going. And in other sectors where that support isn't needed because they're shifting out of lockdown, by all means scale it back, but let's not do it for those people who genuinely are unable to work. I mean, we've got a self-employed support scheme as well, very similar to the furlough scheme in its operation. You know, there you can think about, for example, a hairdresser. I mean, a hairdresser currently is not allowed to work in the UK. They won't be allowed to work for quite some time. And yet they're being lumped in with people who do lots of other occupations where they are allowed to work. And this just is not good for those people, and it's not good for our economy in the long term either.
Yeah, hairdressers not being able to work has been a major problem for me as well. We will talk more in detail after, but first we're going to get some contributions from people who are listening. I haven't had a chance to look through everyone who's logged in, but I've got a list of names of people who have questions already. So I'm going to go through each person one by one. If they're not logged on, I will then move on to the next person. So the first person on my list is Yasmin Qureshi. She is the MP for Bolton and the Shadow Development Minister and a colleague of Anneliese Dodds. Yasmin, are you here with us?
Yasmin is here. Just give me a second. I think I have to unmute her.
I'm just unmuting myself.
Here we go.
I'm here. Hello?
Hi there, Yasmin. Can we hear your thoughts on what you make of what your colleague, Anneliese Dodds, has been saying?
Well, firstly, I want to congratulate Anneliese on being, in fact, in British politics, the first female Shadow Chancellor, because we've not even had one of those in the past. And I think it's a testament to the great abilities and excellent talent that Anneliese has. Secondly, I wanted to say, I think what she was saying made complete sense. She was saying that, you know, the government needs to, and I know if we had been in power, that we would adapt to each industry and recognize the fact that different industries have different challenges and thereby supporting those people. So I'm in complete agreement with what Anneliese is saying. And I think in a pandemic, you have to think outside the box. I think far too, perhaps some of the thinking has been very traditional by the government. And I think recognizing individual circumstances, recognizing individual businesses is a key thing. So I think, you know, what Anneliese has said has been great. And other things that she's spoken on, I mean, one group of people, furlough as a member of parliament is something that I've had so many people write to me with different issues who can't claim furlough, either because they're self-employed, haven't been for 3 years, or some people, and I know Anneliese has written about this and has asked the Chancellor on this, is, for example, people who are employed by some organisations like the BBC. BBC insists that they are made into self-employed contractors, but they still pay their taxes, so they're PAYE, but they can't be furloughed. And the BBC is not, you know, and they're not the only one. Other people who work for temping agencies, for example, they pay their PAYE taxes, but they're not self-employed because they're PAYE, and they're stuck because the agencies won't furlough them. And that's a really crucial, because it's kind of hits, you know, well over probably 1 million people in the country. And Anneliese, again, you know, has raised this in the party. So I just want to say, you know, I mean, Anneliese did a great job. I wish her well. And I know that she's got great ideas, and she's been, you know, she's been a great, she will be a great chancellor once we get into power.
Not a big surprise there from Yasmin Qureshi, who's very complimentary of Anneliese Dodds. She's a Labour MP, they are colleagues. I'm going to move on. And we're going to do something that Labour tend to do at their press conferences. I don't know if the new regime is going to do this, but we're going to take 2 or 3 comments at once and get Anneliese Dodds to respond to them in batches. So the next person is Shehab Qureshi. He's an investor, a businessman, and a fellow at the London School of Economics.
Hi, thank you. You know, the thing that's going around my brain cell is that over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a collapse really in our trust of democracy and government, particularly in the UK and the US. It goes back possibly to the dawn of the internet era. You know, you've got Tony Blair who takes us to war on a pack of lies. You've got a whole bunch of bits and pieces happening in the early 2000s. And I just wonder whether COVID-19 is going to be almost the death sentence for Western democracy as we know it. Is our confidence in democracy ever going to be restored?
Very interesting question. Anneliese, so 2 things for you to respond to there. The first one from your colleague Yasmin, who mentioned about thinking outside of the box when dealing with this. And the second from Shehab, who's got a very interesting question about trust in politics and whether or not this is the end of democracy as we know it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much indeed, both. And thank you, Yasmin. That was extremely kind of you. Goodness, her cheeks getting red there. I suppose just very brief comment on this, actually, for the benefit of those who aren't in the UK. So the furlough scheme that was introduced is analogous to lots of short-hour working schemes across the rest of Europe. Of course, in the US context, we've seen the rise in unemployment support that's occurred. In the UK, we still have really pretty low levels of unemployment benefits. So it's clearly a choice that governments have to take which direction they go into. In the UK context, this has been complicated by the fact that our labour market is really very fragmented and complicated. So, we have a lot of contracting arrangements, people working for agencies. This has meant that, when you have a system that's based on an ordinary employment relationship like the furlough scheme is, or quite a relatively narrow conception of self-employment, as with our self-employed support scheme, you have a lot of people falling out of it, and then obviously our unemployment support isn't sufficient. So I just wanted to comment on that really quickly, just to provide the context there. And so Keith's question, I think this is a really interesting issue, and a very worrying one as well. And I've been looking at some of the polling data within the UK about people's trust in government to deal with this pandemic, and relating that to previous developments around public opinion. Without going into too much of the details, there's been a big argument in the UK because one of the government's advisors did something that was, to all intents and purposes, against the guidelines, but then the government said, no, it was within the guidelines. The feedback that we've had from polling that we've seen is that a lot of people are treating this very similarly to another big scandal time in UK politics, which was the expenses scandal, which I'm sure a number of people will remember, where the same kinds of sentiments were expressed then, that, there's one rule for them, so there's one rule for the government and politicians as a whole, there's another rule for everybody else, right? And we're seeing the same kinds of phrases being used by the public around this time. Does that necessarily diminish people? I think it diminishes people's trust in the national government, definitely, and that's clearly extremely concerning right now, because we need to have that trust there, particularly as, for example, the lifting of the lockdown means that the public health messages are more complicated. So we need to have that trust. It's very important. But actually, do I think it's affecting trust across the board in public institutions? I'm not sure that it is. And in the UK, certainly, we've seen people's trust in, for example, our National Health Service, also in their local government, being still pretty high, and people being very supportive of those institutions. So I think, to me, it's really an issue about, I guess, government in Westminster particularly being the issue. And I wouldn't want us to generalize that to a distrust of public institutions. And I hope, obviously, you would expect me to say this as an opposition politician, that, as quickly as possible, we can get to a situation where that Westminster government is viewed as being trustworthy, right? And is actually up to the caliber of what our National Health Service is doing in our other public institutions. I think that would be the lens through which I'd look at this right now.
Yeah, it's been an interesting few decades, to say the least. We've seen the rise of anti-establishment politicians. We saw that particularly throughout the referendum campaign. And you're right, now is a time where you need politicians to be as trustworthy as possible when you are relying on people to be compliant for public health reasons. Now, the next person to give their thoughts is Hussein Kanji. He is a partner at Hoxton Ventures, a venture capitalist firm in London, an occasional advisor to the British government on tech startup policy.
Hi, Anneliese, thank you very much. My question is, going into the Brexit headwind and looking at kind of the economic forecast even before the pandemic, how does the government intend to pay for some of the stimulus on the labor side in order to overcome this? And it's not like the US government, where the printing press is effectively free or at no cost, given the cost of treasuries.
Fantastic. And we'll get one more question. We'll group them together. So the second question will be coming from Hanan Ashegh. She's the founder and CEO of the Goodwill Caravan, a non-profit humanitarian charity that runs anti-trafficking protection projects for refugees, primarily in Greece and the United Kingdom.
congratulations again for your position. I just wanted to say that I just wanted to ask on the impact, the impact of this pandemic on the charity sector.
Two very important questions. So just to quickly sum up, the first one from Hussein is essentially, how does the government pay for a lot of the stimulus that it is pushing through the economy? The furlough scheme has been one of the biggest bits of intervention from a British government into the economy in history. It has cost billions and billions of pounds. Where is this money coming from? And another incredibly important question from Hanan: what impact is this having on the charity sector? We saw a lot of work being done on this at the start of the pandemic, saying that the charity sector was essentially being ignored and not getting the funding it needed. Can we get your response on those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I guess we're not yet at the stage of even the stimulus, and yet we already have seen enormous funds being spent because, of course, we've had, as was mentioned, the furlough scheme, self-employed scheme as well, many billions of pounds going just into retaining businesses. And then ultimately, I agree with you, we will need to have a stimulus. We'll need to be promoting demand ultimately at a time when it's very, very weak. We know that both households and businesses, where they're able to, when they aren't already, staring down the barrel effectively of going bust, that they are saving more than they have for a very, very long time. So we will need to somehow stimulate the economy as we come out of this. How is this going to be paid for? I mean, I think there are different schools of thought around this, obviously, as people will be aware. So on the one hand, there are some who say, well, actually, in a low interest rate environment, it's possible for governments to deal with higher levels of debt, with a greater potential deficit than they would normally, because that will potentially be eroded over time. But, I'm always aware that that set of circumstances may not continue necessarily into the future. We could see developments in emerging economies, for example, that would mean that there would be changes around those interest rates, that we could be moving into a different situation. And in that context, we need to make sure that we have a fiscal response which is not going to be choking demand back down again. That would be very, very problematic. So, we saw obviously after 2010, a number of measures which did seem to dampen down demand quite a bit. Now that we can't move into those circumstances again after this crisis. We'll need to be making sure demand's going back up again. But also secondly, we saw an approach where in the UK, low and middle income earners saw their living standards stagnate for really a very long time, for all the period really from 2010 right up until about 2019 or so. Whereas those at the very, very top, there were tax cuts, for example, income tax cuts, and there wasn't that stagnation. Now, I think after this period of, what has been sacrificed for quite a lot of people, there is a view that we need to have a fairer distribution of this into the future, that, those with the broadest shoulders should be looked upon to make more of a contribution. I think that's what many people are calling for out of this crisis. And certainly this kind of approach that I would call for, ultimately also because we've seen through this crisis quite how lacking in resilience so many UK families have been. A quarter of UK families don't even have £100 in the bank. That was the case before this crisis started. I expect there'll be even more, sadly, fitting into that category now. Hanan's question about charities, I think, is very, very important. There has been a UK support package for charities, some of which has been delivered through the National Lottery in the UK. And while we welcomed that package, we have said, well, look, ultimately there will need to be additional funds going into this sector, both because of obviously the reduction in donations. And, I'm speaking to you not very far away from the charity Oxfam, which employs hundreds of people in Oxford, which is cutting its staff base now. Quite a bit of that seems to be driven by a reduction in people's giving behaviour. But it also needs to be driven, we think, the government response by a recognition that actually in the UK, huge amounts of quite fundamental services are actually delivered by charities in the third sector. And therefore, if they don't have the funds to continue providing those services, it will have quite a negative impact on people's health, on different communities and so forth. So it's definitely an area that we need to keep pushing on and working on. It's critically important.
Yeah, it is an incredibly important sector and makes a huge contribution. Couple more questions from people who are listening. Sarah Khan Bashir MBE, founder and owner of a leading law firm, SKB Law, based in Bradford, Yorkshire, in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Shehab. Hi, Anneliese. Rather than a question, it's more a reflection as a lawyer working in this legal industry that's undergone massive change. I've been working in the law for 20 years and have not seen such a significant change as we have in the last few months. The most notable change for me has been the embracing of tech in the legal industry. So it's for that, when you become Chancellor, I will be looking to you for some investment to continue the investment, hopefully. We've seen a change in the way a lot of procedural hearings are being done via remote, whether that's Skype, Zoom, whichever platform is of choice. However, my concern is for the clients that would have to access justice that way, and more investment needs to be done in terms of tech and training for clients accessing justice that way. The second point is, I've also, from a personal point of view, given I've been working so long in the law, seen a change in the work-life balance of a lot of lawyers. Do we have to go back to that normal? Do we have to go back to that office model? Is that going to work going forward? Can there be more investment in firms who need the tech to ensure their lawyers can work in their way? That's something I'd really welcome looking at. And the final thing, because I've only got a minute, I've been told, is we do a lot of work with youngsters who are aspiring to come into the legal profession. Work placements have been cancelled due to the recent events. This significantly impacts more, in my experience, on Black and brown students aspiring to get into the law. We need to see more investment in more schemes that reaches out to those students to welcome them and help them on their journey into accessing a career in legal profession.
Very interesting question. The next person is Salman Shaikh, former UN diplomat, international mediator and peace builder. He's also the head of the Brookings Institution's Middle East Center and the founder and CEO of the Sheikh Group, whose work in the Middle East and Gulf regions is supported by the FCO.
Thank you, Shehab, and congratulations, Anneliese. It's great to have you as Shadow Chancellor. Inshallah, you will be Chancellor, and we look forward to that. I wanted to think a little bit longer term. It's great that Labour has started this public policy forums, or asking Labour members to input into that. I do wonder that there is an era of pre-COVID and post-COVID, whether in fact thinking bold will not be bold enough. And here I know you and Ed Miliband have suggested things regarding the climate emergency. I would have thought the giants that we're looking at today are the climate emergency. They are inequality, and it's building resilience. And may I suggest an idea that perhaps we think something along the lines of that Beveridge report, a big Build Back Better commission that looks at that, but which, and this is the thing for you to respond to, please, where we also put at the heart a question around this whole perpetual need for economic growth. Economic growth, which we understand why we need it, but which increasingly studies tell us is not bringing the well-being, the resilience, the safety that citizens in the UK, but also more worldwide need. So could there be such a thing that links those subjects together, where at the heart of it, it's a look at economic growth and also global cooperation, and where there is a model of much more civic engagement in that respect. In fact, could there even be a cross-party effort in that respect, rather like we saw in the 1940s, and which led, thank God, to a Labour government that built the welfare state and the NHS. Thank you.
Anneliese, can we get your responses to those two thoughts and questions from Sarah Khan Bashir and Salman Shaikh?
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, both. And goodness, there's so much in what you said, and I agree with it. First of all, in relation to Sarah's points, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that this period has indicated how there are many, many possibilities through the use of tech, both in terms of, opening up people's access to different ways of working, changing the work-life balance, etc. But also, as you hinted at, I think there are potentially many dangers as well. And we all knew there was a digital divide before, but it's even starker currently. And of course, that's one which tends to map onto existing inequalities and intensify them. So we really need to be dealing with this, I think, and doing so in an accelerated way. I mean, the kind of changes that were occurring to work anyway because of digitization, I think clearly they're being accelerated very, very quickly during this period. And the critical issue will be to make sure that everyone has the capacity to use those mechanisms and is not discriminated against as a result of them. And I think that's very, very challenging, actually. It's very difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And, it's interesting what you were saying about these methods in the law and how, in one way they could help, but in other ways, some clients might need help to be able to use them. Your points around young people, I think, are really important as well. And again, I think the kinds of mechanisms that we're developing, lots of the time, many of them were in the private sector around helping people to have access to different professions. I've particularly been involved with some of the work going on in the accountancy profession around trying to ensure there's more diversity, not just in recruitment, but then in progression through companies as well. That is really going to have to be accelerated because so many of our young people currently, whether they're graduates or otherwise, they will be experiencing a really, really challenging jobs market right now. I mean, problems for older workers as well, let's not forget about them, but particularly for young people too. And then in relation to Salman's points, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's interesting that in the UK, the Trade Union Congress has put forward plans for what they've called a National Reconstruction Council. We've been calling for government to be as inclusive as possible around these tasks of rebuilding and recovery. And there's a strong appetite, I think, from business, trade unions, civil society, and from us as the opposition as well to work together around a lot of this, exactly as you said. And I think there's also, interestingly, there's a very different approach to many of these matters. I would say in the population, there's been quite an interesting set of different research projects carried out by a group called Britain Thinks, and they've been asking people to fill in what they've called coronavirus diaries, COVID diaries. And what they've indicated is that people in the UK are thinking very, very carefully about where they live, their community, how they protect other people, what their local environment is like, and they're working much more with other local people. I've seen it on my own council estate, actually, how people are working together to protect the green areas. We've got a tiny nature reserve here. People suddenly trying to clean that and, help with that in a way that they never had done before. So we've got to build on that, I think, into the future and take those really, the very positive things that have happened in a context of clearly an awful, negative and destructive disease, and try and build on them for our future. And clearly the area where we must do that and do so very, very quickly is around, as you say, the climate crisis, where we don't have any time to lose. So absolutely agree with you on that.
I'm going to ask you another couple of questions. The first one is from Danish, who is a director at the Next Gen Consulting, Next Gen Consulting, which is a management consulting firm. The question is, what is the likely long-term impact of COVID-19 on international trade, especially with respect to dealing with China? Can we get your response to that, please, Ms. Dodds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very important question, and it's one which is quite difficult to discern right now, but where I would say we see some slightly worrying developments. I mean, I'm someone who really believes in the power of trade when it's obviously properly regulated, when it's fair trade as well as free trade. We know that overall increases our wealth as a world when we have those free trading relationships, when they're fair ones. But actually, we've seen clearly some pretty undignified kind of scraps effectively between countries over some of the essential materials for dealing with this disease. We haven't seen the kind of rule-based approach that we would have wanted, a kind of multilateralist approach. You know, I fear that may be the case as well when it comes to creating any vaccine that could be produced, where again, there could well be conflict between nations over manufacturing of that, the essential materials for producing that. And overlaid on that, I suppose, we also have a turn towards a more protectionist approach from a number of nations and a much more nationally driven approach. I think that would be negative. I mean, we may well need to see in the UK and in other countries some more so-called onshoring of supply chains, simply because, you know, if we, for example, look at the amount of goods transferred by air freight into the UK, you know, that's very significant. That will need to change into the future. We can't continue with that with the climate crisis. So we need to have some change. We need to have potentially some onshoring, but ultimately, you know, it's far better if this can be done in a planned way and not as a result of those trading links being broken and done so in a destructive way. I would say that when it comes to China, you know, it's difficult for us to predict what their future approach will be. You know, clearly, and I want to be careful here not straying into the territory of my colleague Lisa Nandy, who's our Shadow Foreign Secretary, but, you know, we have seen very forceful approach from China around provision of some of the material for dealing with this disease, and questions that could be being used as a mechanism for diplomacy. Well, I would always go back to the need for multilateralism in these contexts. I think that's when we tend to have the best results for everyone, and not just potentially the best results for those countries which are particularly powerful economically.
Now, we started this section of the discussion by getting some thoughts and opinions from one of your Labour colleagues, Yasmin Qureshi. We're going to end this section in a very similar way. We're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to go to Naz Shah, the MP for Bradford West. She's now the Shadow Minister for Community Cohesion, and I have no doubt that she'll have very positive things to say about you in the same way Yasmin did.
Hi, assalamu alaikum. Afternoon, everyone. First of all, can I just say thank you to Concordia Forum for inviting me back here, and thank you for Anneliese for taking, especially on a Sunday afternoon when we're so busy with families, and taking that time out. It's always a pleasure for me to join Concordia and say hello and meet so many people. A few things for me really is that what I'm looking forward to, what I'm really pleased to hear from Anneliese, is the kind of to address the infrastructure issues, especially post-COVID, and the BAME, the report that came back, and which really highlighted those inequalities. And I'm really pleased to see what Labour is looking at in terms of the infrastructure, poverty of infrastructure, if you like. So there's no poverty of aspiration amongst our communities, but what I do see is that we do not have those policies, especially economic policies, that focus on those communities that need them the most. So for me, in Bradford West, for example, we've had, in the last few weeks, we've had 100 million taken away from councils, and those majority that have been impacted upon are Labour councils. So what I'm really pleased to see is and hear about is really not, I wouldn't mind Anneliese just touching on that if she could, about the commitment to really put the money where it matters. So not just in those places where we have growth and where we don't need, the need isn't as much. So that's what I'm excited about with having, and I'm also excited about the idea that there was this conversation before COVID and before Keir Starmer started, that we would be, you know, we'd be in opposition or a government in waiting for the next 10 years. What I can see post-COVID is that actually we will be a government, and I'm really excited that we will be a government in four years, hopefully this May, and I'm looking forward to that. And I think Yasmin covered everything in terms of reiterating and reinforcing what Anneliese was saying. But I do really think that we need to focus on, for me in particular, for places like Bradford West, I have a 51%, more than 51% Muslim population, and we still haven't got that right. In terms of the infrastructure support, in terms of the economic support. I've got one of the youngest cities in the whole of Europe, a very young population. I'd like to see some conversation about that. But thank you, everyone. And thank you, Shehab, for hosting this the way you have, as always. Thanks.
Anneliese, can we get your response to that? I think a lot of people are wondering about how funds will be directed and where it will be directed. Naz touches upon the BAME review that came out just a few days ago. A response to that would be incredibly helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I would share really Naz's thoughts about, how lovely it is to be with all of you. And, thanks very much indeed again for the invitation. I mean, I think Naz is absolutely right that, particularly in the UK, we're seeing the impacts of many of the existing inequalities thrown into stark relief as a result of this disease. The review that came out, just for those who aren't in the UK, there was a review around the impact of COVID on Black and minority ethnic communities that came out last week. And it was very, very disturbing because it did indicate that there's a disproportionate impact. And to me, it's pretty clear that that is driven by those inequalities. It's driven by, poor housing. It's driven by the kinds of jobs that people find themselves in and the lack of progression into other areas because of structural discrimination, lack of access to health facilities and so on and so forth. And that will have to be dealt with. And I think one of the frustrations that I've had is that actually we haven't seen, we know there's a disproportionate impact, but we've not seen the debate around how we can prevent that kind of disproportionate impact into the future. It is critical that we deal with it. And certainly from an economic point of view, I'm very cognizant of those inequalities. And in many cases, as Naz intimated, the UK is far behind other countries. I mean, we're the most regionally unequal country in Europe, for example. So we really do need to deal with those inequalities into the future.
Absolutely. Both Naz and yourself touched upon being on this call and how helpful it is. How have you found the phone call, the conversation, and the work that Concordia has been doing in the last few months and last few years or so?
Yeah, well, I heard about this from Stephen Timms, who I think has been involved with the group for some time and has really enjoyed his interaction with it. And I find it really helpful to, I say, be here to speak with you. I hope someday that we will be able to maybe be in the same place, although obviously for this kind of transatlantic organization, there will always be some use of video conferencing. But I would just say if anyone wants to continue this discussion, if you wanted to ask a question and there wasn't time, please always feel free to get in contact with me. I'm really keen to be open and available and really appreciate people's thoughts today.
I think for me, if I can just add, for me as a Muslim woman, I think what's really, really important is finding other people in positions of leadership across the spectrum, across the globe, and being able to have that safe space to navigate those thoughts, be able to share them. You have that kind of collective responsibility, you have a collective support network is really, really important. And I found it very, very useful. I do hope that we are going to be meeting, and Muddassar, thanks for all the work that you and your team do. I do hope that we'll be meeting soon in person to be able to have that kind of exchange of ideas, because it really, there isn't enough for Black and minority ethnic politicians, the leaders in our fields to come together. There's nothing quite like Concordia. So I really value it on a personal note and I get a lot from it. So thank you.
Yeah, I think a perfect way to sum up the end of the phone call. I'm going to pass you back over to Muddassar, who I think has a few things he'd like to say.
Well, look, I know I found this incredibly fascinating. Anneliese, you've been so generous with your time, your thoughts, and I really wanted to thank you both. And earlier on, you mentioned Lisa Nandy. I just want to let everybody listening know that in line with our transatlantic ambition, we're actually doing a session with Lisa in 2 weeks' time, where she will be speaking to the Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, who served under Obama and who is tipped for high office under Biden. We'll be continuing to do such transatlantic sessions. But before we go into that, and before I introduce our next session on India, thank you so much, Anneliese, and thank you so much for moderating this so wonderfully. I may have to call upon you again. You're obviously such a natural pro at this. Thank you both, and thank you, of course, all the MPs. I noticed that we had 3 other MPs. We obviously had Naz, we had Yasmin, both of whom have been part of the network for almost 10 years now. But we also had Abena. I don't know if she's still here. Noticed that we had Abena Apong, a new MP.
Hi, I'm just listening.
Hi, Abena. Notice you joined. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to all the MPs who took the time out. Thank you again, Anneliese Dodds. Thank you again, Shehab. And you're listening to the Concordia Forum's 14th session on distant socializing. We're now moving towards our next session, which is going to be looking at the rise of fascist tendencies in India. It gives me great pleasure to introduce us to our next host, Professor Shehab Khan, who has, of course, been involved with our organization for over 10 years, since our inception. He will introduce the rest of the panelists and take it from here. Over to you, Professor Shehab.